Good evening, everybody. My name is Douglas Sprang, and I lead the Energy and Environment series for the MIT Club of Northern California. Tonight's event is the sixth in a series of all virtual events during our 2020 to 2021 season, featuring top speakers in the field, with this being our first panel discussion of the season covering the subject, could California have a Texas-sized power outage? We have enabled live Q&A, and I will do my best to get as many of these questions to our moderator as I can, although past experience does suggest that we won't get to all of them. We will also answer many of the questions we got from online registration. I'll be back at the end of the program to announce the speaker for our next event, but now I would like to introduce Trevor Wende, our moderator for tonight's event, who will introduce our panelists and orchestrate tonight's program. Take it away, Trevor.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, so just really quickly, an introduction. I find this topic really fascinating because I've spent the last 2 decades of my life in entrepreneurial ventures and in some cases in consulting roles within the energy and energy technology space. Most recently, that's involved me in a project using artificial intelligence to predict and understand fluctuations in supply and demand in electrical markets. So when I see an event like we saw in Texas, to be honest, the very first instinct as a MIT alum was, wow, this is going to be amazing data. But then, of course, the reality of the event sets in. And so just to talk about what the purpose of this this evening session is, in last month, we had an energy crisis in Texas, and it had really significant both human and economic consequences. And we, of course, would want to understand that better just in its own right. But that comes after last year in the summer of 2020, the California grid had some potential hints of maybe having some problems with capacity and supplying. And we had a series of both public safety power shutoffs, but also some rolling blackouts because of capacity issues. There are some prognosticators that say that we might be headed, therefore, in the same direction as where Texas has recently ended up. And with the both human and economic consequences, that's obviously highly undesirable. So we pulled together a team of experts in the industry who you'll soon meet, and want to have a discussion and present multiple viewpoints about where they think we are with respect to that, and then also what we could potentially do about it, or where we might go from here. So that's the purpose of this event. I'm going to start off with just some very, very simple content that's going to be probably too basic for most of the folks in the audience, especially given the detailed nature of the questions that we've seen so far. But I just want to make sure that we're all speaking from the same kind of dictionary here, and that I'm not going to throw out, or we as panelists won't throw out something that's not easy to understand. So give me just a second here. Okay, so just to start off with, this is quite basic, of course, but when we talk about the grid, we're talking about kind of 4 elements of that. So there's, on one hand, the generation and supply. There's the high voltage transportation of that, which we call transmission. There's the lower voltage transportation of electricity, which we call distribution. And then there's the interface where that actually is sold to the user, residential, commercial, industrial users. In the historical context, these were vertically integrated, regulated monopolies, and there was good reasons for that and how that came to be. But typically, on the state or even local level, there would be companies or government agencies that would manage from the full left side to the right side of this diagram. You might hear the term deregulation used in this discussion. There was a process that began in the late 1990s in the US that thought about how we might be able to improve on that, on the vertically integrated monopoly structure. And the main thing for the purpose of this discussion is to separate out on the left side the generation from the transportation elements in the middle. And then there was some element of also being able to compete on the retail side on the far right, which is a little outside the scope of this. But it's important to then, I said the word deregulation, which is a little bit of a misnomer. It's really partial deregulation, or maybe even better to say a differently regulated scheme, because on the left side now you've got a generation industry, and that's federally administered. So you've got FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And then on the far right-hand side, you've still got the state and local regulations, and you'll hear people refer in this to the PUC, or the Public Utility Commission. And that is the domain, that far right-hand side, the retail delivery of electricity to customers, is the domain of those states and the Public Utility Commissions. And in the middle, that left this sort of service, which has been structured in part of the US to become these what are called independent system operators, or regional transmission organizations. So you can see it's a little bit of a mishmash. We've got some parts of the country which aren't colored in here at all, which stayed more or less in that older structure. And you've got all of these different colors, which each gave us their own version of differently regulation. And in particular, for this discussion, we've got the pink one down here, which is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which we've all heard or caught in the news. And then for close to home, we've got the California ISO, or CAISO, or CAL-ISO. And those are taking care of that middle ground and making the market for the electricity between that wholesale market between the generators and the retail customers. So with that as sort of the basic just background for this discussion, let me move on so that we can, give me a second just to get out of this view. Okay. Okay, so with that basic background content, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to go into a brief presentation about the sequence of events that happened in Texas before we start our kind of full panel discussion. So to start with, I'd like to introduce Loretta Lynch. And Loretta is actually the former president of the California Public Utility Commission, and continues to stay deeply involved and also educate others in regulatory and policy issues in California and other geographies, energy supply. Also, I'd like to introduce Tom Popick. Tom is the chairman and president of the Foundation for Resilient Societies. And there he specializes in the regulation issues surrounding electrical grids, both from reliability and economic perspectives, including testifying on such issues before the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee. Third, we've got Matt Barmack. Matt is the Vice President of Market and Regulatory Policy at Calpine. Calpine, with 76 power plants and nearly 26 gigawatts of total generating capacity, is one of, if not the most important electricity suppliers in this conversation in terms of the US and in particular the two markets in question in Texas and California. And then finally, Hannah Grenade. Hannah has worked 10 years within McKinsey & Company's electric power and natural gas practice, where she literally wrote the book on energy efficiency for the US economy, and has been also involved in entrepreneurial ventures in the energy arena. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas. And Thomas, I'll put up the slide so you can go ahead and just prompt me as we want to move to the next, as the next slide in the sequence.
Thank you very much, Trevor. So I'm excited tonight to talk first about what happened in Texas. My group has put together a number of slides, and since this is a technical audience for the most part, I'm just going to be talking through the data on the causes of the ERCOT rolling blackouts. If you go to the next slide, please. I want to set the scene for what the resources are in ERCOT. They have a winter seasonal adequacy resource planning process. It has 83 gigawatts of resources, which is quite a bit. You can see about 2/3 of the resources for the winter are natural gas-fired plants, about 17% coal, a little over 6% nuclear, and then we get down to about 9% wind, which is an intermittent resource. There's been a lot of information on the news about how the ERCOT portion of the Texas grid really isn't connected to the western or the western or eastern interconnections. And so you can see that ties are very tenuous. There's only about 1% imports into the ERCOT grid. Next slide, please. The folks in ERCOT, when they do their winter planning, they do it prudently from an engineering standpoint. So they derate certain resources according to what they could be expected to get under operating conditions. So the thermal plants are derated by a factor of 0.81. The very minimal ties or import lines are derated by 0.69. There's not a lot of hydropower in Texas, but that's derated by 0.54. And then when you get to the renewable resources, the wind and the solar, the derating factors are pretty big. So it's 0.43 for the coastal wind, 0.32 for the panhandle wind. For the big wind farms out in Texas, wind other is a bit of a misnomer, but those are derated by over 80%. And then because the sun doesn't shine all that strong in Texas, the solar is derated by 0.07% or by 93% down. Next slide, please. This is a display of what actually happened during the blackouts that occurred February 15th onward. And so what you can see here is the generation stack for ERCOT. On the y-axis, we have gigawatts of both generation and demand. You can see at the bottom in the purple, that is the 2 nuclear plants in Texas, that's base load. In the gray, you can see the coal-fired plants within the ERCOT region. The light blue would be natural gas. And then up towards the top of the stack, you can see the green, which is the wind, the gold, which is solar, a little bit of pink, which is the imports. The red line at the very top is the forecast demand, and that's a very important point. It's the forecast demand, it's not the actual demand. We all know as a matter of physics that the actual demand has to equal the generation at any point in time. The black area of this chart is the blackout time. And what happened in Texas, the generation was not able to meet the forecasted demand. And as a result, there was a blackout of about 1/3 of otherwise would have been demand in Texas. And you can see that blackout persisted for a number of days. So we have really quite good instrumentation as to what happened with the different generation sources in Texas during the time of the blackout. Big takeaway, though, is that black period, that black segment, those are rolling outages. That was a very, very large proportion of what otherwise would have been demand or load, up to 30% at times. Next slide, please. Here, what we can see is how their planning process rolled into the resources that they actually had. So the previous winter peak on January 17th, 2018 was about 66 gigawatts. The extreme winter scenario that they planned for was about 67 gigawatts. You can look at the red line up at the top of this chart at about 77 gigawatts. And that's actually what the peak was at 11 a.m. on February 15th. You can look at the planned resources to serve that peak, and that was quite a bit lower. That was about 67 gigawatts. You can see what it's made up of too. The light blue are the thermal plants, and about 7 gigawatts of wind. What actually happened during this series of rolling blackouts? Well, first of all, the planned resources was about 10, actually about 9 gigawatts below the experienced peak. So even if all the resources had performed perfectly to plan, they still would have had rolling blackouts. But it's also important to look at the rightmost bar, the actual resources on February 15th at 11 a.m. And you can see that's down about 20 gigawatts from what the plan was. The reason that that's down principally is that there wasn't enough natural gas for the gas-fired plants. There was also some tripping off of coal plants and nuclear plants. And at that particular point in time, the wind was down by about 40% of what the expected plan would have been. So it's really a misconception that you hear sometimes in the media to pin the cause of the rolling blackouts on Texas on just one thing. It's really a combination of under planning of resources and then resources not performing as expected. Next slide, please. This is another way of looking at what happened. So you can see the demand over the planned scenario was about 9.6 gigawatts. The thermal plant outage is about 18 gigawatts. The wind turbine deficit's about 3 gigawatts. And then not too much contribution from hydro holdbacks or imports. It's interesting, the solar panels actually overperformed at that particular point in the day about 1.5 gigawatts. Next slide, please. This graph here shows what was happening over not just a point in time, but the sequence of several days. The gray shaded area is the time of the rolling outages. They started around 1:30 in the morning on the 15th, and you can look at the different types of generation, nuclear in the purple, black being the coal, the wind being green, the light blue being natural gas. And what happened around 1:30 in the morning on the 15th, all of the generation sources started to underperform, with the exception of nuclear that then had a trip off later that day at one of the units. But again, from this chart, what we're trying to show is that all the resources underperformed to their plan. So just to summarize, we have really good data on what happened in ERCOT. We can confidently say that there was no single cause, but we can also observe that this was a system that was very dependent on natural gas, interdependent with natural gas, and that's where in a lot of ways it's has some commonality with the California grid. And Trevor, that concludes my intro here.
Great. Okay, let me just get back. Okay, so just before we move on, I wanted to pause to see if any of the panelists had anything to add or comment just on that contextual background that you think would be interesting for our audience. Okay, so let's move on. I had a question, and I think I'd like to start with asking this to Matt. I just heard this comment around natural gas plants being very, very important to that, and the similarity, that being one of the similarities to the California market. And of course, that's something that CalFine is very, very intimately familiar with.
Yeah.
How is this a superficial similarity, or is this quite profound? and meaning that we might have the same type of vulnerability as was seen in Texas in this case.
Yeah, thanks, and just also thank you for the invitation. And as you pointed out, we experience this very directly. We have about 9 gigawatts of gas capacity in ERCOT, and about 6 something gigawatts of gas capacity in and around California. So we kind of lived through both events in the last year. And gas is very important to both systems. I would say there's some pretty critical differences, just especially well, first of all, with respect to gas supply itself. Basically, the vast majority of the gas for our plants in Texas comes from Texas. And, I didn't quite leap at the opportunity quickly enough, but, one additional piece of context I would add to Tom's excellent introduction is, one thing that the ERCOT blackouts revealed was just really strange and unforeseen interactions between the gas system and the electricity system, which I don't think anybody really anticipated. So just to give you an example of that, yeah, we had trouble getting gas supply to our plants. But one reason for that is when ERCOT, or maybe the transmission utilities started implementing rolling blackouts, they actually blacked out gas pipeline compressor stations. They weren't on some list of critical infrastructure. So there was this feedback that we couldn't get gas to make electricity, and that led to blackouts, which further limited the gas supply. And maybe we can get into that more, but it's just a little bit more color on the fact that the gas supply for our plants in Texas is really concentrated in one basin. California is a little bit different in that respect. We get a lot of our gas from Texas and the Southwest more generally, but we also get a lot of gas from Alberta. So the supply is, the gas supply itself is a little bit more diverse, but I think the generation mix in California is significantly more diverse. So Texas has a lot of gas, a lot of wind, some coal, but California has a decent mix of gas, hydro. We still have some nuclear. We have somewhat more diverse renewables, sort of more of a mix of solar and wind, and then also geothermal and some other resources. And then effectively we have a much more diverse supply because we're much more interconnected to surrounding states. So Texas is sort of the Texas grid is sort of its own island, and California or at least the CAISO part of California in capacity terms relies anywhere from 5 to 10%. Now it could be even higher, 10 to 15%, call it, on imports, and that that has its own vulnerabilities because we're dependent on long transmission lines. But I think there's some similarities, but there are also some key differences.
Any other thoughts, panelists, on specifically the natural gas infrastructure? So Loretta, I wanted to actually dive a little further back. You were at the CPUC in the thick of what was in California biggest energy crisis, and in that what we saw was there was certainly some market and regulatory issues, but in addition to that, we saw some specific market participants who would be considered to be bad actors in terms of not playing per the rules of the game. in Texas, what we're seeing is most of the backlash is sort of, at least currently, being directed at the regulatory bodies. But do you think there's any analogs there in terms of the market participants and their influence on what happens?
Sure. Basically, the parallel between California and Texas, and first, Trevor and Doug, thanks a lot for having me. I went to the school way down I-95, so I appreciate hanging out with the smart kids from MIT for this evening. But the parallel here is that California and Texas both turned their electricity grids over to private corporations to run. And both states allow these private corporations who run the grid and also run multiple electricity markets to cater to the market participants and not protect consumers in their states. So if you run your grid and your markets for the benefit of the players, then you're not ensuring that businesses and families come first and have reliable, safe, not to mention clean power. So the question is, what do we want here in the United States, in California and Texas? Do we want safe, clean, reliable power at reasonable costs? Or do we want enhanced markets with multiple arbitrage opportunities and less reliability? Because that's what we're getting. And that's what we got 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, there were unexplained plant outages, just like there were in California in August. And I think Tom has done a really good job of explaining some of the plant outages in his snapshot of what went wrong. But there in Texas, we understand what happened, which is people ran the hell out of their plants and they didn't weatherize them. So all the ways that natural gas plants still work in Massachusetts and Wisconsin, and how all the ways that windmills work in Minnesota and Norway didn't work in Texas because folks didn't put on the $10 or $15 or $100 fixes that would have allowed those plants to keep running. So it's about plant outages and the price for keeping that reliability. It's about extraordinary exports in California, both 20 years ago and now, which created, from my perspective, artificial shortages, which raised the price. And California in August raised the price just a little too much, and everybody got blacked out. But ultimately, it comes down to these private corporations creating market rules that do not prioritize California's needs. And one thing we did 20 years ago was fix that by state law. And our ISO, or grid and market operator, has a state law requirement that it must run California's grid in order to ensure the maximum amount of resources for California at the minimal prices. And the ISO just failed in its statutory duty. In one way it failed, and I think that this is true of Texas too, is that they have created multiple markets for electricity products that allow and in fact incent myriad arbitrage opportunities. So you've got lots of parallels from what happened 20 years ago and also what happened between Texas and California in this last year. And it all comes down to markets. We should follow the money, and we should prioritize the state's economies and its people and its businesses over markets. And right now, neither Texas or California do that.
So let me move, before we dive into the real heart of the issue. Another thing that came up was an extreme weather event. So people have called this a 1 in 100, or people have said this has never happened before. And Hannah, you had mentioned an expectation for more extreme weather events given what we see in climate change. Should this, Hannah, maybe you can kick us off. Should this change the way we think about providing electrical capacity? Because in the past, this is based on historical patterns, and then you add a margin on that. But is that enough? And should that change, this type of event, change how we think about planning for extreme capacity requirement events?
I think that's a great question. And I would go beyond capacity when we think about planning for these sorts of extreme events. I would actually go back to thinking about the very significant power outage that happened starting in the first energy service territory back in, was it 2003 or 2004, as a function of too much heat, sagging transmission lines, and having those transmission lines touch some trees and cause a very significant outage that cascaded all the way through the Midwest and out to the East Coast, which was in a very regulated market. And I think what that points us to is that this isn't purely about market structure. It's really about imagination in our planning. We're always going to be regulated at some level in energy markets. And the question is really, have we anticipated all of the potential scenarios, and not only more extreme weather events, but the nature of the weather events that we're going to experience, and events beyond weather and other things that would impact the resilience of the grid. So cyber attacks, for instance. Capacity is one way to try to address some of those issues, but simply increasing capacity is not something that would help us, for instance, in the case of a significant hurricane or a windstorm. In the case of Superstorm Sandy, having a lot more generation capacity would not have helped the local markets. And so I think a lot of planning for resilience is about being able to extend the imagination and understand what type of vulnerability of the entire power system we're trying to plan for.
Any other thoughts on from the panel? I think that's a great point about the other, it's not just a weather and capacity threat. Go ahead, Loretta. I think you're on mute.
Yes, could you pull up my maps, the blackout for CAISO, but not for the other Western states?
Yeah.
So as you'll hear multiple times from the ISO, they blame the heat wave in August, and they blame climate change. And yes, climate change is real and happening, but no, climate change did not cause the blackouts in California in August of 2020. That's not the slide. There you go. And if it were climate change and an extended heat wave, that was happening across the Western United States. And frankly, there were higher temperatures in some of the other states, but they kept their lights on. And why is that? In fact, the 3 states that are in green on this map, our closest neighbors, did not even call for conservation because they had plenty of power. So they took care of their people. Now, I would note that all 3 of them have traditionally state-regulated, vertically integrated, or state-regulated markets with vertically integrated utilities. But they all maintain their power supplies. So it wasn't just heat, and it wasn't prolonged heat, and it wasn't climate change. But maybe you could look at California, and if we could go to the next slide, and say maybe there was something unique about California. Nope, not again, because there are 22 municipal utilities in California, the largest being LADWP, but some of you all might live in SMUD territory. None of them blacked out. There was a small transformer blow in LADWP territory, but that was an equipment failure, not a lack of supply or planning or vision. And of course, none of the municipal utilities have markets. Instead, they structure their power systems to protect their economies, their people, and their businesses, and not to protect their markets. So it wasn't about the heat in the West, and it wasn't about the heat in California. So what were the differences? The difference is the California ISO allowed extraordinary exports. It did not investigate unexplained and very troubling plant outages that were occurring right before the blackouts, and it has multiple opportunities for arbitrage. So I would argue that you got to take a look at really what happened with other people and not just in Texas and California. And when you look across the nation, the map that Trevor showed earlier, those states that don't have a color, according to FERC, all those states are in traditionally state-regulated utility structures. Most of those states don't have the same blackout problems that California and Texas have experienced. And even in that 2003, the great Northeastern blackout that blacked out most of the Midwest and the Northeast, the one state that was in the path of that multiple tripping that did not black out was Vermont. Why? Vermont was not yet in any regional market, regionally organized market. It has traditional state regulation. It kept its lights on, and it kept its people secure.
I've got maybe a double click question for you, Loretta, on that. So you do highlight these states, but certainly all of those states sell power on a daily basis and participate. Even there's at least some participating generators in each of those 3 states in the energy imbalance market that operates within CAISO's real-time framework. They can't enter the day-ahead integrated forward market, but so they do export, and that's not necessarily unique. But what allows them then to participate in that market without having the downsides?
Well, the difference there is first they take care of their own and then they export their excess. That's not what California does. California to this day prioritizes exports over native load, meaning exports over what California is forecasted to need to keep its lights on. So when you don't prioritize your people, you get what happened in Texas and in California. When you do prioritize your people, as the California munis do and as all the other surrounding Western states do, what happens is they get to profiteer off of California's woes because we've designed our market so poorly by selling us power at top dollar that they don't need. And we can get into the EIM. It is not the unmitigated success that you think. When the devil's in the details, when you really look at how they define costs and benefits, it is a fire sale for all the other states. So basically, if you can buy renewable power at discounted prices because California makes too much at certain points of the day and California will sell it to you essentially as a loss leader for less than cost, yeah, you'd buy it if you weren't California. So we're basically, and just not me says this, the LA Times discovered that we often pay Arizona to take our solar power at certain times of the day and year. And sure, they'll take it. If we want to be the chumps, they'll take advantage of that, which is what happens day after day in California.
So we've covered a lot of maybe the bad news side of this. Certainly there are differences in California and California ISO from ERCOT. So maybe Thomas or Matt, do you guys want to comment from the comments you said earlier? And you talked a little bit about the similarities and differences, but are there important differences here in terms of resiliency or in terms of capacity beyond just the natural gas supply diversification that we talked about?
Yeah,
certainly.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I would like to talk about a similarity between the two areas, ERCOT and California, that Matt brought up. It's a really excellent point. It's the vulnerability and interdependence between the electric grid and electric drive compressors. And what we hear is that there were a significant number of electric drive compressors in ERCOT that didn't have power. That decreased the line pressure and the natural gas fired plants couldn't generate. There was a similar situation in California that hasn't occurred yet. So two of the compressor stations in the main pipeline that goes from north to south in California are electric drive. And also one of the biggest natural gas storage fields in California, which is Alisso Canyon, the compressors to take the gas out of those fields are electric drive. So thank you, Trevor, very much for showing this particular slide. So this is the PG&E natural gas system in California. And you can see line 400, 401 coming down from the north and line 300 coming through Topcock in the east. There's two major compressor stations in the San Francisco Bay Area that are electric drive. And our concern would be if there are rolling outages, that those compressor stations would be on the list to be exempted from the rolling outages. Likewise, if you go to the next slide, which is the slide that shows the Alisso Canyon storage facility, and that really sits just a little bit north of the LA basin. You can see Alisso Canyon is near the intersection of many of the gas pipelines. That is a critically important storage facility. There's over a dozen electric generation plants that use the gas that's taken out of that facility. So about 5 or 6 years ago, Southern California Gas replaced the gas turbine compressors at Alisso Canyon with natural gas, with electric drive compressors. That was done for environmental reasons, and that's very good for the people who live in the area on a day-to-day basis. But if there are rolling outages and there's not a lot of care to keep the electricity flowing through the feeders to those compressors at Alisso Canyon, that could cause a problem as well. So I just wanted to say that I really think that Matt's comment was quite excellent. We saw the interdependence between the natural gas system and the electric generation system already in Texas, and through research, we can see that as a potential problem in California as well.
Yeah. Trevor, do you mind if I weigh in for a second?
Yeah, go for it. That's
okay. Yeah, I did want to address your question, but I also wanted to push back on Loretta a little bit. First about heat and then about cold. So Loretta, you pointed out that I think you argued that it wasn't particularly hot when the blackouts in California happened, and by historical standards that's sort of true, but I think one thing that's important to keep in mind, and I teed this up a little bit, is California is really part of a broader regional grid and a broader regional market. And I think what was a little bit unique about August here was that it was hot everywhere in the West, and sometimes when it's hot in California, it's not so hot in the Northwest. We can import Northwest hydro, or it's not quite as hot in Arizona as it is in California, and so there's excess supply there. We couldn't rely on that load diversity in August because it was hot everywhere and the loads were high everywhere. On top of that, historically, California has really leaned on excess generation in other states in the West, especially coal. But a lot of that coal is being shut down now, and so this is really this was sort of a new stress test, of whether we can continue to operate the California grid with the same reliance on imports as we have historically, and it seems like maybe that's not the case. And I hear you that the states with sort of more of a traditional vertically integrated structure were maybe better resourced and looked after their own, and there was this well-known or what now well-documented problem with exports from CAISO that I think has largely been fixed, but it wasn't easy for those states either. I mean, they mostly use their own generation, but they're also in the spot market, and the wholesale prices in August at Palo Verde in Arizona were thousands of dollars a megawatt hour. So I don't want to leave the impression that the conditions in August in California and the West were not challenging. They were very challenging. Now, with respect to cold, you brought up winterization, and I think that's a little bit of a red herring with respect to what happened in ERCOT. There was a similar but much less severe incident in, I think it was 2011, and ERCOT implemented these voluntary winterization standards after that happened, and we submitted to that process. And so before the blackouts happened, I'm just speaking for our own plants, ERCOT validated the winterization of the plants that they inspected. It was most of our plants in Texas. And then, as we're sort of diagnosing what happened and how we performed, for the most part, the reason our plants failed was or were out was not due to lack of winterization. We just couldn't get fuel. And then, there's some more technical issues that maybe we can get into later, but there were very large frequency deviations on the system associated with, large units going offline, but then also load being dropped very suddenly that caused, all some other units to trip off because, they have this protective equipment. So I just wanted to push back on the winterization, which I think is a bit of a red herring with respect to the Texas blackouts. Now, Trevor,
do you feel, just on that winterization point, for your plants, do you feel that the measures that that ERCOT asked people to voluntarily comply with after 2011 made a difference?
I'm not really sure. You know, so the 2011 event, as I understand it, there were like, you know, 8 or 9 hours, and it was like 20 degrees, and people at the time thought that was really cold. But what happened a couple weeks, you know, a month ago was way beyond that. So I think, you know, what suppliers probably who winterized, you know, sort of planned to, you know, it may have been sufficient, it may not have. That was not the big issue for us. The big issue was we couldn't get fuel. Okay.
Loretta, you look like you've got a point here.
I would like to respond. So first, I didn't say that it wasn't hot in California. I said it was hot everywhere, which is the whole point. It was even hotter in Arizona and in Las Vegas than it happened to be in California, except for in Death Valley. But the good news is Death Valley doesn't use a whole lot of electricity. But my central point is heat does not equal electric demand. Electric demand has a lot of different elements. Number one, California has done a lot in energy efficiency. So we use less electricity than Texas, even though we are twice its size in terms of load and people. And two, it was the pandemic. So we didn't have manufacturing, we didn't have restaurants, we didn't have theaters, we didn't have all office buildings. A whole lot of stuff was offline on August 14th and 15th. And August 15th was a Saturday. And Trevor, if you could put up that load graph, the graph of forecast demand versus actual demand from the ISO, this tells the tale of what was going on in California. I'm going to let Tom respond to the weatherization and the in Texas and the 2011 lessons learned or unlearned. This might actually be from Tom's slides, perhaps. Tom, did you?
I'm sorry, that was in Tom's slides.
Oh, sure. I think no, I know the one you're talking about. One up from that, Trevor. Number 11, please. I think.
Okay.
Slide number 11. Yes.
Getting there. Just a second. Sorry, I overshot.
There you go. Loretta, is that the one you were talking about?
No, I'm talking about the California ISO forecast demand versus supply. Did that make it into the slide deck?
That might be in your deck towards the bottom, perhaps.
I didn't include it. You said you were going to include it.
Yeah, I don't think I have that one.
Well, then there you go. So what I would say is you should look at the ISO final root cause analysis, table B25, which shows what California planned for in terms of demand. And this was based on ISO forecasts in May of 2020. And they planned for 48,000 megawatts of demand on August 14th. We peaked at 46.8. Now, California, as some of you may know, requires utilities to buy an extra 15%. So California had under contract 52,000 megawatts of power for August 14th. Hot summer day, that's why we had so much. And the ISO demand forecast was exactly almost right. Actually, it was a little over what actual demand was. 48,000, 46.8. The difference was the exports. And the difference was how the ISO operated its day ahead market. I wish we had this B25 slide up because the ISO's own data shows that we forecasted, the ISO and the PUC forecasted almost perfectly for that very hot summer day on August 14th when the whole of the West was hot. The ISO's day ahead market came in significantly below their well-modeled, really kind of tested and verified forecast. And so what did the ISO do? Did they stick with the forecast? No. They stuck with their underestimated day ahead market, released thousands of megawatts of exports, and California blacked out. Because what also happened concomitantly was unexplained plant outages that the ISO and the PUC to this day have not investigated. And that is what raises my Danger Will Robinson antenna, because that's exactly what happened 20 years ago. unexplained plant outages, boom, 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 one after the other. The ISO's markets underestimating and underscheduling and underforecasting what they already forecasted in a very robust process, and the ISO abandoning the robust forecasts to go with their manipulated market that puts California at risk. But I'd leave it to Tom to talk about weatherization and lessons learned from the 2011 blackouts in Texas.
Well, let's. I think there's a few issues to unpack there that I think are quite relevant. I think there's one which is what should be planned for, and we talked very briefly about that, and should more extreme events be planned for. You also mentioned that an important difference between California and Texas, which is that in California, utilities are required to procure capacity, whereas in Texas they're not. And then there is the issue of once that capacity is procured, how do you actually make sure it shows up? And that has to do with both exports and imports and outages and all of those things you brought up at the end. But to take those in order, what's the perfect storm? Barring we of course in California have earthquake risks. You could have a terrorist attack, you could have cyber attacks, but in terms of natural phenomenon, what's the perfect storm in California? Low hydro year, forest fires. What does that look like, and how could, with, as Hannah brought up, with imagination, do you think that both California and ISO could plan for that? Anybody who's
well, my point is they did plan for it. They did plan for it, but then the ISO rejected the very careful planning and instead went with its monkeyed day-ahead market, which it has now admitted had market anomalies. What did they call it? Some practices. This is quoting from them. And the day-ahead market exacerbated supply challenges. Yeah, they exacerbated it right into a blackout.
That's true, Loretta. But if we look at the example in ERCOT, their planning scenario was several gigawatts short of what the actual load ended up being. Is there a scenario where we could be end up in that situation in California?
I haven't studied the ERCOT actual data the way Tom has studied it, so I would defer to his analysis there.
Thomas, what do you think?
Well, I'd like to talk to this perfect storm concept. So I think that there's a different perfect storm that occurs in ERCOT versus California. The perfect storm in ERCOT is a cold snap that increases demand dramatically, at the same time takes generation off the system due to well freeze-ups, plant freeze-ups, and if there are rolling blackouts, interdependency between the natural gas system and the grid. And I also want to say that even if the plants were completely winterized, there's the issue of the gas wellheads in Texas, which are not under the control of the plants, where you have a lot of what's called associated natural gas in Texas. When the oil comes out of the ground, the gas is mixed with that. If the wells freeze up, or if the electricity to the oil wells is cut off, then you're going to get your gas supply constrained. And there's at least some of that happened in Texas. So there's a perfect storm in Texas. But because this is the MIT Club of Northern California, what I'd like to talk about is the perfect storm for California. And that perfect storm, we've already gotten a squall, which was last April 14th and 15th. A significant insight about the perfect storm in California is it's likely to happen the same time each day. And that's about 6 o'clock in the evening at the evening load peak. Because depending on the time of the year, but typically you can get up to 50% of the load in California served by solar. And we know very predictably every day in the evening the sun's going to set. And when the sun sets, there's a very carefully orchestrated load balancing that goes on, where the gas-fired plants have to ramp up, and at the same time, what the gas plants don't serve, there has to be imports. And this is a very, very challenging situation for companies such as Calpine. And so again, that perfect storm is likely to occur about the same time every day. And I'm wondering if, Matt, if you'd like to comment a little bit about the challenge of gas generators with the so-called duck curve in California.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so far it's been surprisingly manageable. And I'm I think I agree with you about what the perfect storm is for California generally. I'd like to put a little bit more color on that. I mean, on the other hand, I'm curious to hear Hannah's views on this, but maybe we don't know what the perfect storm is. Like I don't think what happened in Texas was anticipated by many people. Maybe by you, Tom. But I do think, with respect to sort of the known problems of the California grid, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's basically late summer conditions when the loads are very high, and that's really driven by air conditioning. And it's these critical early evening hours where the solar is kind of falling off, and the solar is just weaker in the late summer because we're further from the solstice. So yeah, I mean, that need right now is met by gas and imports. So, if anything, sort of jeopardizes those resources, we could be in big trouble. So, like, I mean, we've already had Alisso Canyon go offline, which is significantly complicated the way we run the grid. But say if a major pipeline went down, complemented by maybe one of the big interties that connect us either to the southwest or the northwest going down. And then the thing I worry about also longer term is, as we become more and more dependent on solar, that's a growing part of our resource mix. Suppose, and you read about the potential impacts of climate change on California. We could have more humid, cloudier weather. So not only could we have reliability problems in the evening, but on days when the solar isn't available, those problems could stretch back into the afternoon hours. Add to that, sort of we're replacing or trying to replace some of the gas generation with battery storage. Well, that battery storage needs to fill from something. And so if it can't, fill from solar or wind because it's hot and humid and it's still, and the solar isn't generating as much as we expect, that's sort of a double whammy. So like, I agree with you sort of about what the stress case is for California, but I'm sort of conjecturing about how it could be even worse prospectively.
Excellent. And so I want to follow up with one more issue with Matt. And I think that what we've established is that the reliability of natural gas-fired plants is critically important, both in Texas and in California, maybe for slightly different reasons, but those plants are critical for reliability. And there's this issue of firm fuel versus spot fuel for those plants. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the economic challenges of firm fuel versus spot fuel and what the practices are for generators in those markets, whether you're number one on the priority list with, or shall we say, maybe not number one, but higher in the priority list with firm fuel, or whether you're trying to get cheaper fuel, which is spot fuel. How does that work? Yeah,
well, I mean, without going into too much detail, I can comment on that a little bit, but we secured firm fuel in Texas. It didn't matter. We were still cut. So I'm not sure sort of firm contractual arrangements are necessarily ensure firm fuel supply. I can comment a little bit more, not on California or Texas, but on some of the other markets like PJM and New England that have also had gas supply issues. And, you know, there, what the solution has been is really to add dual fuel capability. So a lot of our units in the east have, you know, tanks of fuel oil next to them, so that when we can't get gas, we switch to fuel oil. You know, that's expensive, and it may not be a good solution for every market, but there is a resiliency benefit to liquid fuels that can be stored on site, and just, you know, being able to switch between different fuels.
Yeah, on that point, you can see behind me, this is a New England city. We know all about firm versus spot in New England. We have spot gas, right?
Yeah.
And we at one time had many more dual fuel plants than we do now.
Yeah.
But that dual fuel aspect is a very important reliability factor. And we just hope that the market structures in the places in the country that are dependent upon natural gas fired plants, and that gas may not always be available, that there's a dual fuel backup. It's unfortunate that within the California market, those incentives have not been there. And so the vast majority of dual fuel capable plants have been closed over the last 2 decades in California. And that's, again, really unfortunate.
So I do want to get in pretty soon to what can be done, and looking forward a little bit. But before we get there, we did sort of promise this question of how vulnerable do we think California is, given the current state. So we've kind of presented a lot of kind of bad news information, a little bit of good news and some of the differences. But how big of a problem, or how urgent of a problem is this in California?
You know, I'd love to hear Hannah's ideas about battery storage and whether that is a path out, and all other renewable technologies, because you certainly seem to be on the cutting edge of the technological innovations and how they can be applied.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that. I do think it's a very interesting opportunity to add a little bit more resource diversity. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the experience in Texas and in California is that I think it's been a long held view that having supply diversity and resource diversity in the form of import redundancy and battery storage can help us solve a lot of these challenges. One of the things this experience highlights is how difficult it is to actually make resource diversity happen at the micro market level. So at the California-wide level, there are a wide variety of sources of generation. In any individual market, you might be very dependent for certain hours of the day on solar, for instance. I think battery storage has an important role to play. I think it's an excellent solution for a lot of the associated challenges of transmission and distribution, the things that can take the grid down during extreme weather events. I think where it is more challenging, though, is in the case of a cold snap in Texas. We're simply never going to be able to have enough battery storage capacity to take us through 5 days of a really significant supply interruption. But I think it's another very important lever to pull to be able to further diversify our resource base.
Made an interesting comment, Hannah, just as a follow-on, that batteries could be counterproductive to having a lot of capacity available on the grid. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. I think earlier in our discussions and preparing for the panel, I also made the comment that one of the challenges, I think, of how battery storage is often thought about as being incorporated into the grid is that it's a method for helping us levelize and match supply and demand. So one of the frequent discussions is, can we bring down peak demand and not have to have peak generation capacity in the form of polluting gas and fuel oil to be able to match that peak demand? Can we just shave the demand, and can we supply through battery storage and therefore generate through cleaner sources when they are available, solar and wind? I think what's difficult about that is that bringing a system very tightly into balance in a very efficient way can actually be counterproductive to resilience of the system. And in an interesting way, I think we learned this through the pandemic with our toilet paper supply. The consumer products industry for creating consumer paper and producing toilet paper is extremely efficient. generally runs north of 90% utilization. There's very little slack in that system. And when you experience a massive shock to the system, like COVID, you wind up experiencing a very, very lengthy interruption to what that supply looks like, because the system has been so tightly engineered to have very little slack and to be very efficient. And so I think, battery storage thought of as a redundancy measure can be very helpful. Battery storage, as it's often thought of, to be able to bring supply and demand into balance and decrease the amount of generation we would invest in, could actually be harmful to our ability to resist these sorts of future interruptions.
So I think it's fair to say that this is probably a technology first audience, given the background. But I think that's an interesting point. Is it, and maybe this is a little bit too far forward in the conversation, but is technology without the right structure, either regulatory or policy structure, can that solve the problem? And I guess we talked about storage, but maybe there's microgrids and there's other forms of demand side management. There's distributed generation. Any of those, and anybody who feels up for this one, is it technology alone? Can we solve this? Can Silicon Valley solve this, or does it have to be combined with policy and procedures and regulation?
I mean, I'll take a cut at that. I mean, so I'm not sure. Let's focus on California, because I still view Texas as a little bit more of a black swan. Like I think I understand California a little bit better, and I think we know how we could make the system more reliable. I mean, we could have more capacity, for example, and we could debate the cost effectiveness of that, and we could make sure that enough of it isn't overly energy limited. Like, it's not all intermittent solar and 4-hour batteries, that we have, some firm generation, as well on the system. That could be gas. It probably won't be nuclear in California. We have geothermal, which is a non-intermittent renewable. So, I mean, they're sort of known, I think they're known solutions from a generation adequacy standpoint. But, I think, this discussion and, the recent experiences here, I mean, also highlight, where new technology could be useful. I mean, especially given California's very ambitious environmental goals. So, Hannah was just talking about how storage, it'd be difficult to get through a multi-day blackout with storage, but there are companies that are working on economic multi-day storage, and there's a lot of recent interest also in basically using hydrogen as long duration storage, using electrolysis to make hydrogen and then storing that, and then that's basically a fuel that can be used and can be stored underground. So you can have really large storage to get through really long reliability events. Or we could be looking at different types of firm generation that we haven't really deployed that could be clean, like carbon capture, fossil plants complemented by carbon capture and sequestration. So I think, like, just in terms of solving the narrow reliability challenge, we could do it with existing technologies, but I think there are also additional technologies which could be really useful to address reliability problems and other policy goals as well.
I would just note that along with looking at whether there are technological solutions, you have to look at how much does it cost.
Sure.
And who pays.
Yep.
So and what are we getting for that?
Yep.
California is already in the top 5 states in terms of electricity costs. And the PUC and the ISO and the Energy Commission just did a big dog and pony show about how much more the costs are going to be increasing. So it's not just, is there a technological solution? It's how do you integrate, how much does that cost, who pays for it, and how do you integrate that into the base load, the considerable base load in California of the other ongoing costs.
So what concrete actions does that insinuate, Loretta?
Trade-offs, because they're only 100 cents in the dollar. So we either buy everything and raise prices, which is what California's MO has been, satisfy everybody, and look at our rates go up, woohoo. And then finally, when wildfires expose just how cozy the regulator has been with PG&E and how much PG&E has failed to maintain its system, both on the gas and the electric side, we also have to pay for that in a variety of ways. You know, the one difference between California and Texas is in California, we have objective power plant maintenance standards that were a creation of state law after the energy crisis. The problem is the ISO is no longer enforcing those standards, nor is the PUC. They're not even investigating power plant outages. In Texas, my understanding is those standards are not objective. That when Matt says, hey, ERCOT came and checked us, they checked to see if you guys were going to do what you said you were going to do. And if you said you're going to do A and other power plants were going to do A to Z, as long as you did A, you got signed off. I mean, you, Calpine in particular, I just mean a plant operator.
So I do want to come back before we completely drop technology. You know, certainly there are some solutions here, and Matt's brought up a number of them. But there's a question of timeline and what is realistic, both for storage, which is quite pressing. We've seen a number of Q&A questions come in about that, or demand side management, or load control in more sophisticated ways. So I know Hannah and maybe Thomas, you've looked into this. Do you have comments on what should people think about in terms of that timeline? How is this realistic to see when that could be solving the types of problems we're looking at now?
Thomas, would you like to start? Or, yeah, I mean, I guess my high level take would be that it's not really within a realistic planning time horizon, in the sense that, you know, 15 years ago, we spent a lot of time talking about the utility of the future. And in our planning scenarios, somewhere around 2020 is when we anticipated all of these incredible technologies would have been dispersed across the grid. And we've got quite a lot left to go. I think one of the issues has been that there's been a lot of technological innovation on the generation side, but there are so many facets of delivering total system reliability and resilience that have not really been addressed. And a lot of that is, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of technological innovation as well on the grid side, but less so, I think, in really thinking through it from a vulnerabilities point of view.
Tom, do you have anything to add?
Trevor, were you asking me?
Yeah.
If we're talking about technology, I think that there's some solutions that have come up already this evening. We can talk about storage, we can talk about demand management, and we can very importantly talk about dual fuel. But for California, it's not just technology, it's the market defect. Does the market in California incent reliable and resilient technologies? And I'd have to say, unfortunately, from everything I've observed, is the market in California does not. And ultimately, that is what's going to cause a blackout in California if that isn't rectified, in my opinion.
So what are the things that would incentivize reliable capacity?
Well, first of all, in California, the stakeholder governance system is dysfunctional in California ISO. There's not a lot of transparency for the public. I'll give you an example. There is an established resource adequacy planning process in California where capacity is procured in advance, but the details of that capacity planning process are opaque to the public. The public in California doesn't know which plants are in the net qualified capacity. Well, they know which plants are in the net qualified capacity list, but they don't know the terms of the contracts. And the terms of the contracts mean how much is being paid for that capacity, and also what the penalties are if the capacity doesn't perform. And so without that kind of transparency and accountability within the market structure and the governance process, unfortunately, I don't think California is going to get the reliability that the citizens deserve.
And to follow up on Tom's point, that is an unfortunate holdover from the energy crisis. When California got into the power buying business because the utilities were no longer creditworthy on the ISO's market, the state of California asked for no transparency because they were afraid of being taken advantage of by the sons of Enron. Once they started signing chuffy contracts, they knew everybody would want the same chuffiness. The problem is the utilities said, when we put the utilities back in control of purchasing, hey, we want the same deal the state did. I voted against that decision in 2003, but very sadly, 3 of my colleagues voted for it. So this anachronistic holdover from the energy crisis has meant zero accountability, except for those who are lucky enough to be on what's called the procurement review group, which is the insider star chamber that gets to take a look at the contracts. I think we'd have significantly more accountability and frankly, press coverage and legislative understanding, as well as citizen understanding, if all those contracts were opened up in real time. There's no reason they shouldn't be. They used to be open, and in many other states they are open. It's just that, hey, if you can do things in secret and who knows who you're rewarding and who knows who the winners and losers are, then basically what's happened is you can spin like a drunken sailor, which is what California's done.
And not necessarily get the reliability benefits for the money that's spent.
Exactly. We don't even know how much we spent for how little, because we don't even know if there are non-performance penalties. It's all secret.
So would PJM, an ISO in the Eastern Seaboard, they have these explicit and highly transparent capacity payments that they execute through their actually market system. Is that type of structure, does that solve that problem?
The transparency is one part of the solution. The problem with the capacity markets, not just in California, which isn't really a true capacity market, but in other parts of the country, is there's a lot of incentives but very few penalties. And so the capacity payments tend to be large. For example, where I live in New England, the capacity payments are about 1/3 of the compensation the generators get. But there's not really penalties that are commensurate with the capacity payments for failure to perform. And the reason why the penalties are set quite low is they're set through a governance process, which includes the generator operators. And so really, when you look at the problems, you see them in the markets all around the country. Oftentimes it's the lack of transparency, but oftentimes also there's issues in the governance process where the stakeholders through weighted voting schemes and the like are given a lot of say over really how they're compensated as part of the market process.
So basically we have market structures that are created and operated of, by, and for the market participants rather than for our economy.
You know, one thing, Trevor, to your question about technology also, and thinking about a lot of the challenges in market structure in all of the various regulated and restructured markets across the country. If you were to take technology in isolation and say, what could you do on the consumer side fairly independently of system operators and regulated utilities or deregulated utilities? One thing I would really love to see more innovation on is on fractionalizing load. I think one of the challenges for most people is that, you know, your home is operated off of a single or a couple of HVAC systems. And so if you wanted to revert to sort of a demand response in an emergency situation, all of the various innovations around things like taking your dishwasher offline or not running your washing machine are not nearly as helpful as being able to say, I would just like to heat or cool one room of my house. In an emergency situation, I'm willing to settle for only one room being conditioned, and I will take 80% of my house offline. But that's something that most homes just aren't built to do. You know, you're either on or you're off for your HVAC. And I think more innovation around fractionalizing your load so that you can set your own priorities as a homeowner or as a commercial building operator and say, in an emergency situation, I'm going to very finely slice all of my electricity consumption and put it in a priority order that works for me, and then allow a system operator when shedding load to be able to run down that stack. I think that's something in my mind that would make for a very interesting smart home of the future opportunity that, you know, we could really do really purely on the technology front.
Hannah, that's such an excellent point. If you just look at the Texas example, there are so many people that would have been so happy if they could have heated just one room in their home. And then if everyone had done that, that would have really reduced the magnitude of the rolling outages. So that's really a great point. And if we keep on going the way we are with the grid, this kind of fractionalization has to be a key part of the solution, especially under peak load conditions. Great point.
So I do want to move to one last topic, and this is a great segue because this is something that people can start to think about and do themselves. We were just talking about regulatory and policy issues, which is driven in our democracy, hopefully in most cases by the people that are going to vote for their leaders and politicians. So if you're in this audience and you want to learn more or you want to do something about this, I'd like to hear just briefly from each of you, what would you recommend to them? How do they learn more? What do they do? Should they buy a Powerwall tomorrow, etc.? Why don't we start with you, Loretta?
Contact your legislature and ask them why they're voting to confirm people who won't fix exports over native load in California.
Very concise. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Well, if you, Loretta mentioned the final root cause analysis that the joint agencies put together on the August blackouts, and I think for people who are interested in learning more, I think that's an interesting report. The CAISO's Department of Market Monitoring also did some interesting analysis of the blackouts, particularly with respect to the performance of demand response, which wasn't particularly good. So I don't have any specific recommendations about what to do, but to learn more, I think those are good sources. I did want to respond quickly to one issue that Tom brought up. I think the performance requirements for capacity in California are pretty clear. They're basically CAISO tariff requirements. So, opening up the contracts is not really going to help you understand the performance requirements. I agree that there's no transparency of pricing in California. That was a deliberate policy choice. Because without debating the merits, but partly as a result of the energy crisis, the PUC and state policymakers were concerned about setting up a resource adequacy scheme that would be subject to more federal jurisdiction and a very transparent, efficient capacity market, such as PJMs. If one existed in California, it clearly would be FERC jurisdictional. So there's kind of a history there. I think the bigger issue is not performance requirements. It's sort of what counts as capacity in California, and there's been a lot of improvement in that respect. Solar was sort of vastly overcounted for a long time, and its counting has diminished significantly recently, but still, it counts as capacity, and the blackouts in August basically occurred after dark. So when the solar wasn't generating at all. So I think, there's probably more attention that's needed to some of the mechanics of the capacity scheme in California.
Great. Thomas, how about you? What are the walking away points for folks in the audience here?
I think that this is going to sound a little bit wonky, but we have to understand that 2/3 of the country's electricity markets are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And the oversight body for that is the Senate Energy Committee. If citizens could do just one thing, I would recommend that they contact the senators for their state and they emphasize the importance of electric reliability and the importance of their state being represented on the Senate Energy Committee. And that would influence the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which ultimately sets the tariffs in these electricity markets. And I know that's a little bit wonky, but for this type of audience, MIT Club of Northern California, it's well within the capability of many of the members to actually write a coherent half-page letter to their senators. And I think that that would really increase attention to the issue.
And just to come full circle, we have a new senator in California who happens to be on the Senate Energy Committee, who happens to be an MIT grad, and that's Senator Alex Padilla. And if I could emphasize one thing to Senator Padilla, it would be require transparency in California and make FERC require transparency of all transactions nationwide. Because if we could put a little sunshine on this, I think we'd be watching the worms squirm.
Hannah, how about your thoughts?
I absolutely agree on transparency. I mean, I think however you decide to structure your market, the more transparency you can provide into it, the more brains you've got working on the problem and the more competition you can bring to bear. So absolutely. You know, to your question about how to learn more and be more involved in these markets, I would add one more fairly wonky thought to it. The way I learned about electricity markets was actually by reading old FERC reports. There are some really outstanding government reports produced over the last 20 or 30 years discussing how these markets work, the benefits and drawbacks of various market design features. They are long and they are very dense, but they are incredibly thorough and well explained. And so for an MIT audience, I would absolutely point you to those as a great resource.
You're right, that is very wonky of all the recommendations, but well, we're just about out of time. I wanted to take 1 minute just to thank our esteemed panelists. I really enjoyed this discussion and hearing all these points of view and very obvious the knowledge that you brought to bear and the insight that you were able to share with us was really valuable. So sincere thanks on behalf of the MIT community and the MIT Club of Northern California in specific. And with that, it's short apologies to the audience that we didn't get to all of the great questions that you guys had. We were able to weave most of them into some parts of the discussion, but thank you for your participation and interest in that as well. And then I'm going to hand this back over to Doug. If you, as the audience, wouldn't mind to just hold on for just 1 minute. Doug has a little bit of information about other events that are going to be happening with the MIT Energy and Environment Club, and of course, his final thoughts.
Well, first of all, thank you, panelists and moderator, for a really great presentation in all regards. It was very, very interesting. I think this is a pretty tough, complex problem, and we really thank you a lot for shedding a lot of light on all of this. I think that transparency issue that was raised is maybe one of the most important ones we heard today. And I think we should all take that pretty seriously. So at any rate, again, thanks for all of you for participating in this and doing it at short notice. I just want to point out to our audience that actually Tom Popick and Hannah Grenade are located on the East Coast. And so we actually brought you a national program tonight, and we're very proud of that. Okay, what are we going to do next? Only 1 week from today, we are going to honor Lynn Jurick, who is the co-founder and CEO of Sunrun, who is now the largest solar company in the United States because of their acquisition of Vivint last year. And we're honoring her as a pioneer in clean energy. She has really taken solar to new heights over the past decade or so. And we do this every now and then to honor somebody who's really stand out. And in this case, we're just delighted to be able to honor Lynn. So I hope that many of you who are watching tonight will also be able to join us next Thursday, just a week from tonight, for that program. And that's it for now. Thank you again all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you or hearing from you again at a future program. So long, everybody.